It was just before dawn when the ground started to shake. Not the gentle tremor that makes you pause for a second, but a violent, roaring lurch that tore buildings from their foundations like they were made of paper. In seconds, apartment blocks folded in on themselves. Hospitals vanished under clouds of dust. Schools, mosques, markets gone. The cold winter air filled with screams, sirens, and the terrible sound of concrete cracking like thunder. People ran barefoot into the streets, clutching children, calling out names that would never answer back. In one shattered neighborhood, a man crawled out from under a collapsed wall, blood streaking his face. He stumbled toward what used to be the local radio station, now just a pile of twisted metal and broken glass. Miraculously, a backup generator still hummed in the basement. With shaking hands, he patched together a microphone, turned on the transmitter, and spoke into the silence. His voice cracked, not from fear but from exhaustion and grief. "We need help," he said, barely above a whisper at first, then louder. "We need everything: tents, medicine, water, people who can dig. Please. We are disappearing." He didn't know if anyone would hear it. The power grid was down. Cell towers were silent, but somehow the signal got out. A ham radio operator in Greece picked it up. A journalist monitoring emergency frequencies in Berlin heard it and posted a clip online. Within minutes, the message was everywhere. On Twitter, WhatsApp groups, TikTok, Instagram stories. Not polished, not scripted. Just raw human desperation crackling through static. And that's when something unexpected happened. People didn't wait for governments to act. They didn't wait for press conferences or official aid pledges. They just moved. A teenager in Canada saw the clip before school and started a donation page from her bedroom. By lunchtime, it had raised $10,000. In Morocco, a group of university students canceled their weekend trip and instead packed medical kits they'd bought with their own money. In Brazil, a retired firefighter messaged his old team, "Who's flying out tomorrow?" In Seoul, a small bakery owner announced he'd donate every one of that day's earnings to relief efforts, and customers lined up around the block just to buy bread. This wasn't charity in the usual sense. It wasn't distant pity. It was fury. Fury that people were dying under rubble while the world slept. Fury that children were freezing in the snow with no blankets. Fury that help wasn't coming fast enough, and that fury became fuel. Back in the disaster zone, survivors huddled around car radios, listening for any sign that help was on the way. They heard the original broadcast replayed, now layered with voices from around the world. A teacher in Nairobi saying, "We're sending supplies." A fisherman in Portugal offering his boat to carry medicine. A grandmother in Chicago knitting woolen hats and shipping them by the hundreds. It wasn't just aid, it was a message. You are not alone. But hope came with a warning. The roads were blocked. Airports were damaged. Even if help was coming, getting it to the right places would be nearly impossible. Local volunteers, many of them injured themselves, began forming human chains to pass water bottles and blankets through the ruins. Others used flashlights to signal helicopters, spelling out SOS with their bodies in open fields. Every minute counted. Every life hung by a thread, and still the call kept spreading. Not through official channels, but through shared humanity. A viral video showed a young boy pulling his little sister from the wreckage, her leg broken but alive. That clip alone sparked a wave of donations for field hospitals. Another showed an elderly woman sharing her last piece of bread with a stranger's crying baby. People didn't just see statistics, they saw faces. They saw themselves. What made this moment different wasn't just the scale of destruction. It was the speed and raw emotion of the response. In past disasters, aid often arrived days or weeks later, wrapped in red tape and bureaucracy. This time the world didn't wait. It roared into action like a single heartbeat, fast, loud, and full of fire. Of course, no one knew yet how messy it would get. How good intentions could sometimes cause more problems than solutions. How too many volunteers with no coordination could clog the very roads rescue teams needed. But in those first hours, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that someone had cried out, and millions had heard, and they weren't just sending help. They were coming. Planes were being booked. Trucks were being loaded. Boats were being readied. People with no training, no official role, no plan beyond "I have to do something." They were packing bags, saying goodbye to families, and heading straight into the unknown. Not because they were heroes, but because they couldn't sit still while others suffered. In the cold, dark ruins of a once bustling city, A woman wrapped a thin blanket around a shivering child she didn't know. She looked up at the sky, streaked with the first light of morning, and whispered, "They're coming." She didn't know if it was true, but for the first time since the earth split open, she let herself believe it. The message didn't just spread, it exploded. One moment it was a shaky voice on a broken radio. The next it was everywhere, on phones lighting up in bedrooms at 3 a.m., in group chats buzzing with urgency, on social media feeds flooded with pleas, plans, and promises. People didn't wait to be asked twice. They saw the images: collapsed buildings, dust-covered faces, a child's hand reaching out from rubble, and something inside them snapped into action. Not out of duty, but out of sheer burning need to do something. In a small town in the Philippines, a group of high school students skipped class, not to hang out, but to organize. They turned their school gym into a donation center. Within hours, it was packed with bottled water, canned food, warm clothes, even handmade face masks. They didn't have a permit. They didn't have a plan beyond send it where it's needed. But they had heart, and that was enough to get things moving. Meanwhile, in Germany, a Syrian refugee who'd fled war years ago watched the news with tears in his eyes. He recognized the streets, the mosques, the way people screamed in that particular mix of Turkish and Arabic. He remembered what it felt like to lose everything overnight. So he opened his laptop, created a fundraiser, and wrote a simple message. "I know what it's like to be buried under silence. This time we won't let them be alone." He shared it with a few friends. Within a day, strangers from over 40 countries had donated more than €1,000,000. People weren't just giving money, they were leaving messages. "My grandma survived an earthquake. This is for her. I can't go, but I'm sending socks. Please tell them we see them." In Jakarta, motorcycle clubs, usually known for loud rides and weekend races, did something no one expected. They emptied their clubhouses, filled their bikes with medical supplies, and formed convoys heading toward the nearest international shipping port. "We're fast," one rider said in a video. "If roads are blocked, we can go where big trucks can't." Their videos went viral, not because they were polished, but because they were real. Helmets on, engines roaring, boxes strapped to their backs like armor. In Lagos, a young tech team working out of a garage rerouted their delivery drone project. Instead of dropping off packages, they programmed the drones to fly over damaged neighborhoods, taking aerial photos and mapping which buildings had collapsed, which streets were passable, where survivors might still be trapped. They uploaded the data to a public server and tagged rescue groups worldwide. "We don't have boots on the ground," their post read, "but we can give you eyes in the sky." Even in places far from the disaster zone, people found ways to help. In rural India, women's collectives stitched hundreds of cloth bags filled with soap, toothbrushes, and sanitary pads, basic dignity items often forgotten in emergencies. In Norway, a retired teacher sold her late husband's record collection and used every kroner to buy thermal blankets. In Mexico City, street vendors donated a day's earnings and cooked hundreds of meals, not for locals but to fund emergency kits they'd never see delivered. What made this wave different wasn't just how fast it moved. It was how personal it felt. This wasn't faceless aid from distant governments. It was your neighbor, your classmate, your online friend, people you could message, thank, cry with. Donors weren't just numbers on a screen. They were real humans posting updates like, "Just sent 200 sleeping bags. Hope they get there in time." Or, "My dog slept on the floor so I could send his bed." Social media became a lifeline, not just for sharing news but for organizing. Hashtags turned into action hubs. People posted what they had: extra tents in Istanbul, fluent in Arabic and Turkish, available for translation, van with fuel, ready to drive to affected zones. Others posted what they needed: looking for pediatric antibiotics, need engineers who can assess building safety. Strangers connected across continents like old friends, united by one mission: get help where it's needed, fast. But with so much energy, so much love rushing in all at once, things started to get messy. A well-meaning group in Canada shipped 10,000 winter coats, only to learn the region was now facing unseasonable rain, not snow. A church in Texas sent boxes of canned pork, forgetting that many survivors were Muslim and couldn't eat it. Volunteers with big hearts but no training showed up at border crossings, eager to help but without visas, medical licenses, or even basic knowledge of the local language. They meant well, but they ended up blocking roads meant for ambulances or overwhelming local coordinators who were already stretched thin. Still, no one blamed them. How could you? They came because they cared. And in the middle of all this chaos, something beautiful happened. Local people, those who lived through the quake, started stepping up as guides, translators, and leaders. A young woman who'd lost her home became the voice connecting international donors with neighborhood needs. A retired teacher turned her damaged living room into a coordination center, using WhatsApp to match incoming aid with the right villages. The world's fury wasn't perfect. It was loud, disorganized, sometimes clumsy, but it was alive. It pulsed with urgency, with empathy, with a refusal to look away. And for the first time in a long time, people in the disaster zone didn't just feel like victims. They felt seen, heard, remembered. One evening, as the sun set over a makeshift camp, a group of survivors gathered around a phone playing a video compilation. Clips from around the world, kids holding "We love you" signs, volunteers packing boxes, musicians playing songs of hope. Someone pressed play and silence fell over the crowd. Tears flowed, not just from sadness but from the shock of being cared for by strangers who'd never even set foot in their country. That night, under a sky full of stars and drone lights, the line between us and them began to blur. Because in that moment, there was no them, only us, and the fury of compassion, wild, imperfect, unstoppable, kept rolling forward, one act of kindness at a time. At first, it felt like a miracle, this flood of help pouring in from every corner of the world. Trucks loaded with food, volunteers arriving with shovels and first aid kits, donations lighting up phones like fireworks. But as the days passed, the miracle started to show cracks. Good intentions, it turned out, weren't always enough. Sometimes they even made things harder. The roads leading into the worst-hit towns became jammed, not just with emergency vehicles, but with cars full of well-meaning strangers. People showed up with backpacks full of bottled water and bags of clothes, hearts full of hope but no idea where to go or who to talk to. Some didn't speak the local language. Others didn't know that the area they were trying to reach had already been cleared, or that it was too dangerous to enter without proper gear. Local rescue teams, already running on empty, found themselves stopping to explain the same things over and over. Please don't block this road. We can't use expired medicine. This isn't the right place for toys. One afternoon, a group of volunteers from another country arrived with a truck full of winter jackets. They were proud of their effort, until a local coordinator gently explained that temperatures had risen and what people really needed now were clean water containers and hygiene kits. The volunteers were crushed. They hadn't meant to waste anyone's time. They just hadn't known. And then there were the rumors. With so much happening so fast, false information began to spread like wildfire. A fake message claimed that aid trucks were being looted, so some donors held back supplies. Another post said a certain neighborhood was completely wiped out, when in fact people there were still alive and waiting for help. Scammers created fake donation pages, stealing money meant for survivors. Some even twisted the tragedy into political arguments, blaming governments or spreading conspiracy theories that only added fear to an already broken place. The emotional toll was just as heavy. Many volunteers had never seen this kind of destruction before. They came ready to save lives but weren't prepared for the silence after a rescue failed, or the look in a parent's eyes when they realized their child wasn't coming back. Some broke down in the middle of rubble piles, overwhelmed by grief they hadn't expected to carry. Others stayed too long, refusing to leave because they felt guilty going home while others suffered. Back in the camps, survivors started to feel confused. One day a truck would arrive with rice and lentils. The next it would be filled with baby formula no one had asked for, or shoes in the wrong sizes. Sometimes aid came in such huge amounts that local storage spaces overflowed, and good supplies sat rotting in the sun while other villages went without. Coordination was nearly impossible. There were too many groups, too many voices, too little time. A woman who'd turned her damaged garage into a distribution point found herself crying one night. Not from sadness, but from exhaustion. She'd spent the whole day turning away donations she couldn't use, calming frustrated volunteers and trying to figure out how to fairly divide the little she had among hundreds of families. "I'm grateful," she told a friend over tea. But I wish someone had asked us what we actually needed before they sent it. Still, amid the mess, small acts of wisdom began to rise. A retired engineer who'd lost his own home started walking through the camps with a notebook, quietly asking people, "What's missing?" He wrote down everything: batteries for hearing aids, painkillers for elders, school notebooks for kids trying to study under streetlights. Then he posted the list online, not as a plea but as a guide. "If you're sending help," he wrote, "here's exactly what will be used tomorrow." In another town, a group of local teens, many of them still sleeping in tents, created a simple sign-up system for volunteers. If you wanted to help, you had to register, show basic skills like first aid or driving, and agree to follow local instructions. It wasn't perfect, but it cut down on chaos. They even made a hand-drawn map showing which streets were open and which buildings were too unstable to enter. And slowly, the outside world began to listen. International aid groups that had been sidelined at first started reaching out, not to take over but to support. They offered logistics, medical teams, satellite phones, tools that local heroes didn't have. Instead of rolling in with their own plans, they asked, "How can we help you?" That small shift made all the difference. One powerful moment came when a global shipping company offered free cargo space, but only for items on the community's verified needs list. No more random donations, just what was asked for when it was asked for. Other companies followed. Social media influencers stopped just sharing emotional clips and started directing followers to official coordination pages. People began to understand, real help isn't about how much you give. It's about whether it actually reaches the hands that need it. Even the volunteers started changing. Those who stayed past the first rush began to learn. They picked up a few words of the local language. They washed dishes in the camp kitchen. They sat with grieving families not to fix anything, but just to be there. They realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer isn't a box of supplies, it's your quiet presence. There were still mistakes. There always would be, but the fury that had once been wild and scattered was starting to find its focus. It wasn't slowing down, it was sharpening. And in the middle of all this confusion, something unexpected happened. Trust began to grow. Not blind trust, but earned trust. Between locals and outsiders, between strangers who'd never met but were now working side by side in the mud and dust. A volunteer from South America and a teacher from the affected region ended up sharing a meal under a torn tarp, laughing over how they both hated cilantro. A group of teenagers from 3 different countries built a temporary playground out of scrapwood, just so kids could feel normal for an hour. The road ahead was still long. Homes needed rebuilding. Trauma needed healing. Systems needed fixing. But the chaos was no longer drowning hope, it was feeding it. Because in the mess, in the mistakes, in the tears, and the tired hands, humanity wasn't failing, it was learning. And that, more than anything, gave people reason to believe that the fury wouldn't fade. It would transform into something smarter, kinder, stronger, something that could actually last. The turning point didn't come with a speech or a ceremony. It came quietly in the middle of exhaustion, when people stopped trying to do everything alone and started listening to each other. One morning, in a half-collapsed community center that still had one working laptop, a retired engineer sat hunched over a keyboard. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His own house was gone, but he'd been mapping every aid request that came in, from villages without clean water to families needing insulin. He built a simple online form, shared it through local networks, and asked just one thing: tell us what you need, not what you think we should send. Within hours, hundreds of responses poured in: diapers, antibiotics, chargers for phones, seeds for spring planting. Real, specific, urgent needs, not guesses. He posted the list online with a clear message: if you're sending help, please match it to this. And something amazing happened. People listened. Donations shifted from random boxes to targeted support. A pharmacy chain in Europe saw the request for medicine and shipped exactly what was listed. No extras, no waste. A group of university students in Canada used the list to organize a Build-A-Kit drive. Each box contained the same 5 items, all verified as needed. Efficiency replaced chaos, not because someone took control, but because everyone chose to cooperate. Around the same time, in a town where women had been quietly running food lines and caring for orphan children, a small group decided to step forward. They weren't politicians or aid workers, they were teachers, seamstresses, mothers who'd lost their own homes. But they knew their neighborhoods better than anyone. They set up a coordination tent near the main square and put up a sign, "Local needs, local voices." At first, outsiders were skeptical. But when they saw how fast these women could direct a truck to the right street, or translate between languages, or calm a panicked volunteer, trust grew fast. They didn't push people away. They welcomed them, but with clear roles. If you can drive, we need you here. If you speak Arabic and English, come translate at the clinic. If you just want to hold a child while their parent digs through rubble, we have a place for that too. Their calm authority became a lifeline. For the first time, help wasn't crashing in like a wave. It was flowing like a river, guided by those who knew the land. Even the big aid organizations began to change. Instead of setting up separate camps with their own rules, they started asking local leaders, "How can we support what you're already doing?" One international group brought in heavy machinery, but only after consulting with neighborhood teams about where it was safe to dig. Another sent doctors, but paired them with local nurses who knew patients' histories and cultural needs. The result? Faster rescues, better care, fewer mistakes. Technology helped too, but only because it served people, not the other way around. That garage-based drone team from Lagos? They started sharing real-time maps with local coordinators, showing which roads were passable after aftershocks. A coder in Argentina built a free app that let volunteers sign up for shifts, track supplies, and report issues, all in 3 languages. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. And because it was open source, anyone could improve it. Perhaps the most powerful shift happened in how people saw each other. Volunteers stopped seeing themselves as saviors and started seeing themselves as partners. They learned to ask before acting. Is this helpful? Do you need this? Can I do it this way, or is there a better way? That small act of humility changed everything. It turned frustration into teamwork, confusion into clarity. In one village, a group of foreign volunteers arrived ready to build temporary shelters. But instead of starting right away, they sat with elders first. The elders explained that certain materials wouldn't hold up in the spring rains, and that families preferred shared courtyards for emotional support, so the volunteers adjusted their plans. The shelters took longer to build, but they lasted, and more importantly, they felt like home. Kids played a quiet but vital role too. In camps where schools were destroyed, teenagers organized outdoor classes under tarps. They taught younger kids math with bottle caps and reading with torn pages from donated books. Some even started hope journals, where survivors could write or draw their feelings. These weren't therapy sessions. They were acts of normalcy, tiny anchors in a world turned upside down. And through it all, the fury didn't disappear. It just changed shape. It was no longer a wild, scattered storm. It became steady, purposeful, like a fire that had been tamed not to burn less but to warm more. Donations slowed, but they became smarter. Instead of one-time bursts, people set up monthly giving. Instead of sending random clothes, communities adopted specific villages, checking in weekly. Do you still need socks? Should we send more soap? Long-term thinking crept in. People realized recovery wasn't about one heroic week. It was about showing up again and again, even when the cameras left. Local markets began to reopen. Not with fancy stalls, but with blankets on the ground selling bread, batteries, and secondhand shoes. Every sale was a step toward dignity. Every customer was a sign that life was returning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a group gathered around a small fire, not for warmth, but for connection. There were locals, volunteers, doctors, drivers, students. No titles, no flags, just people sharing tea and stories. Someone played a song on a dented guitar. Others clapped softly. No one talked about saving anyone. They talked about what they'd learned, who made them laugh that day, what they hoped to rebuild. In that moment, the line between helper and helped vanished completely, because everyone was healing. Everyone was rebuilding. Everyone was human. And the world's furious response, once loud and messy, had settled into something deeper, a shared promise. Not just to fix what was broken, but to build something better together. Not with perfection, but with patience, not with noise, but with presence. And that, more than any shipment or rescue, became the real turning point. Months passed. The news cameras had long since packed up and moved on to the next crisis. The hashtag stopped trending. The donation pages slowed to a quiet hum. But in the places where the earth had cracked open, life didn't stop. It kept growing slowly, stubbornly, like green shoots pushing through broken concrete. What surprised everyone wasn't just how much had been rebuilt, but how much had changed for good. The emergency response that began as a chaotic wave of global fury hadn't just delivered supplies, it had planted seeds. And those seeds were now taking root in unexpected ways. That retired engineer who built the Needs List website, he never went back to just fixing radios. He teamed up with young tech students from the area and turned his simple tool into a permanent community platform, one that could be used for floods, fires, or future earthquakes. It was run entirely by locals, updated in real time and open to anyone who wanted to help. No bureaucracy, no delays, just people helping people the way it should be. The group of women who'd set up the coordination tent, they didn't disband when the tents came down. They opened a community center instead, part school, part clinic, part meeting hall. It became a place where elders taught traditional crafts to teenagers, where mental health volunteers offered quiet support, and where neighbors planned how to make their streets safer next time disaster struck. They called it the house that listened, because it was built on the simple idea that real help starts with hearing what people actually need. And the global volunteers? Many went home, but they didn't forget. Some stayed in touch, sending books for the new schoolroom or funding solar lamps for families still without electricity. Others used what they'd learned to prepare their own communities. In towns across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, people started local disaster response groups, trained, ready, and connected to networks overseas. They weren't waiting for governments to act. They were building their own safety nets, one neighborhood at a time. Even governments took notice. Not with grand speeches, but with quiet changes. Aid policies began to shift. Less top-down, more community-led. Emergency funds now included money for local coordinators, not just foreign experts. Training programs taught international responders how to listen first, act second. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The fury of ordinary people had done what years of reports and meetings couldn't. It had proven that the best help comes from the ground up. But the real legacy wasn't in systems or policies. It was in the small human moments that kept happening long after the headlines faded. Like the bakery in Istanbul that still sets aside one day a month to bake bread for families still rebuilding. Or the school in Brazil that holds an annual Solidarity Week, where students collect supplies not for faraway places, but for communities they've stayed connected to since the earthquake. Or the fisherman in Portugal who still checks in with a family he helped evacuate, just to say hello, to remind them they're not forgotten. And in the affected regions, something powerful had taken hold. Pride. Not the kind that says we did it alone, but the kind that says we rose together. Children who once played in rubble now helped paint murals on rebuilt walls. Scenes of hands reaching across oceans. Of cranes lifting not just steel, but hope. Elders told stories not just of loss, but of the strangers who showed up with blankets and stayed to share tea. One spring morning, a young person stood in front of a newly planted olive grove, trees donated by a farming collective in Greece. Each sapling had a small tag with the name of the town that sent it. The wind rustled the leaves, soft and steady. It wasn't just a grove. It was a living thank you note growing taller every year. Of course, scars remained. Some buildings were never rebuilt. Some losses could never be filled. But grief and gratitude had learned to live side by side. People didn't pretend everything was fine. They just refused to let pain be the only story. And the original call for aid, the raw, trembling voice on the broken radio, had become something else entirely. It wasn't just a memory. It was a lesson passed down. When you cry out in your darkest hour, the world might not send perfect help. But it will send people. Flawed, messy, sometimes confused, but fiercely human. And sometimes that's enough. Years later, when another disaster struck somewhere else, the response was different. Faster, smarter, kinder. Because the networks built in the ashes of that earthquake were still alive. The same platforms, the same principles, the same belief. Listen first, act with care, and never assume you know better than those living it. The fury hadn't died. It had matured. It wasn't loud anymore, but it was deeper. It wasn't chaotic, but it was wiser. And most importantly, it was still there, ready, waiting, woven into the everyday fabric of communities who now knew. We don't need permission to care. We just need to begin. So when the next call for help goes out, whenever, wherever it may be, it won't echo into silence. It will echo into action. Not because the world is perfect, but because ordinary people, again and again, choose to answer. Not with pity, but with partnership. Not with saviors, but with solidarity. And in that choice, humanity doesn't just respond, it rises.